Good morning, church. I hope that you're having a great time meeting in a small group, and next week, which will be September the 16th, we'll be meeting back at Victoria Drive Hall, and things will carry on as normal. But for this week, we're going to talk about the Apostle Paul. I'm not going to do a life story or do a great big presentation on him, because that would just take too long. But when I think of the Apostle Paul, what I think of is, here's a guy who was a great gospel communicator, and he set the standard, or set the bar for how the gospel is to be spread, be communicated. He was a speaker, a teacher, a preacher, a church planter. He did all those things. But then on the other hand, when I think about Paul, I think, boy, I could never be like him. And I just, when I read about his life, it's so fantastic. And I think, oh man, how can we be like that? But there's this great text in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 in the first 12 verses. And in a minute, we're going to take a look at that. But before we start that, I want you to have a little discussion in your home group about who do you think is a good model of someone who is known for preaching the gospel. Who do you think is a good model of someone who is known to preaching the gospel, and what is it that you like about them? And so I'll give you a few minutes to talk about that, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about you. Let's begin by just reading the text. I'm reading out of the Holman Christian translation. For you yourselves know, brothers, this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting verse 1. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our visit with you was not without result. On the contrary, after we had previously suffered and we were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but rather God, who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't seek glory from other people, either from you or from others, although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles. Instead, we were gentle among you as a nursing mother nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers, working night and day, so that we would not burden any of you. We preached God's gospel to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom, his own kingdom, and glory. So the thing that we're going to pursue in this text is, according to Paul, what makes an effective gospel communicator? Because my hunch is one of the reasons that the church and people in the church, not our church, but the church generally speaking, are hesitant about sharing the gospel, is we just lack confidence, or we think we're not good enough, or I could never do it like so-and-so. So I want you to first ask a question and get back into having some discussion. And there's going to be 3 questions here about yourself. And the 3 questions are, do you consider yourself to be someone who could mentor others? Second question, do you consider yourself the gifted communicator? And thirdly, do you ever disqualify yourself as a mentor or evangelist because you think you lack the skill? I'll give you a couple minutes to think that one over and have some discussion about that. See you in a minute. Hi, welcome back. I hope that that was a good discussion and kind of got your brain thinking about what it takes to be a good gospel communicator, a good evangelist, someone who uh, can share the gospel, can carry that. We've talked about as a disciple, we're not only followers, but we also are those that further the agenda of the one we follow, that is the Lord. And how do we do that? The the things, the components that need to be present in our life that help us to do that? Well, from this text we read, we're going to identify 7 things, and I think will they be challenging? Yeah, they'll be challenging, but at the same time, I think when we look at these 7 things that Paul describes as good characteristics of a gospel communicator, that we will in some ways be relieved and liberated. I'm hoping, but we'll see how it goes. Let's dive right in. In the first part of the text, Paul says, "We dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition." And in fact, what we discover back in Acts 17 when Paul and his team were in Thessalonica, that they were really treated poorly. And it says that some bad characters were rounded up and from the marketplace, and they formed a mob and they started a riot, and they were demanding for Paul and Silas to appear, and all that kind of stuff. And they were treated badly. Well, Paul says, in spite of all that, in spite of that kind of opposition, we shared the gospel. We told the story. And so that even though they had been treated poorly, and in the city before that, they had been in Philippi, and remember they came out of prison. You may remember that story. That just seemed to be a theme, that Paul and his team would go into a place and they would stir up lots of trouble and face opposition. So what is the first thing that it takes to really be a good gospel communicator is courage. It does take courage, and you can probably identify that with that. It takes courage to be a good gospel communicator. The second thing that Paul gets into is in the sentence he says, the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. In other words, that we come with authenticity. It is who we are. One of the skills, I guess you could call it, of sharing the gospel is to be able to tell your own story. We usually call that a testimony, but telling your own story, and telling the story of Christ. And why do we share it? Because it's real. It really is happening, and it's something that has changed the direction of life. We're not trying to sell anything. We're not trying to trick anybody. We're just saying, if you encounter Jesus, it's real and it's authentic. The third thing that Paul gets at is in the sentence he says, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. Well, think about that. You, as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, as a disciple who is furthering the agenda of the one you follow, you are approved. God has put his stamp of approval on you as one who gets to carry this message, that shares the message of the gospel. And with that kind of approval, the other word I could put in there is we're affirmed by God himself. And he says this is the right thing to do. And so with that confidence in that, then we can share the gospel with authority. And knowing that first it's authentic, and then we say, well, and it's real, it's authentic, and I'm not trying to trick you into anything, and I'm approved by God. There is this authority that we can share from. Then we as we move along, there's a couple things he says. He says we are not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. Why do we share the gospel? Is it going to please people? That's not what Paul experienced. He usually experiences some opposition. But it does please God when we share the gospel. We never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up or use greed, he says. And we were not looking for praise from people. In other words, the word that we'll use to kind of summarize all that is integrity. We share the gospel from a heart of integrity. We don't share it to be impressive. We don't share it to gain anything. We share it because the world needs it. And we feel that sense of urgency to share the gospel, share the message of Jesus with people. We do it with integrity. In the next piece, he says, we cared for you. And then he follows it up. He says, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. And so I want to take a word to summarize that about caring and delighting in others, sharing life with others. And that word is compassion. We share the gospel out of a sense of compassion. And compassion wells up when we realize that I have something that someone else needs desperately, and they need it in their life. And our heart reaches out to them in that compassion. Then he says, we worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached. And he says, we were holy and righteous and blameless when we were among you. In other words, we'll use the word credibility. And I think this is a really important subject. It's important that our lives line up with the message. We're preaching a message of God's love, God's forgiveness, His mercy and grace. We claim that as we come to Christ, that there is transformation that takes place and that our lives take on a different path than before. And so it's important that our lives actually demonstrate that. And that gives the message credibility. Again, the message has credibility when it lines up with the claims. And so this is what Paul is saying is, we worked hard, we were holy, we lived holy, we were righteous and blameless when we were among you. So their lives lined up with the message. That's credibility. And then he ends off with this idea of encouraging, comforting, and urging them to live lives worthy of God. In other words, the necessity of follow through. Don't just be hearers who listen to the gospel, say that's really nice, but be one who lives a life worthy of that and follow through with the message. So when I look at these 7 things, I'll list them here: courage, authenticity, authority, integrity, compassion, credibility, and follow through. These are the characteristics that are true of people like Paul and others who are effective gospel communicators. The one thing that I want to notice through this is that when Paul goes through this, here's what made us effective. These I've chosen, kind of arbitrarily chosen 7 terms that are meant to summarize the different pieces of this text. But the thing that's missing in this is that Paul doesn't talk about gifts and skills and being slick and charismatic. He doesn't talk about any of that stuff. He doesn't talk about looking right or being eloquent. He says, we didn't even come with you with eloquence, right? None of that is part of this. It's more about character. And so being a great gospel communicator is about being a person of character. And that's what this chapter is really about, is what does Christian character look like? And so as we continue to follow Christ, it is our character that will continue to be transformed, and this is what will make us be effective witnesses. So those are the things that are really important about being a church, being a follower, a disciple that is focused on sharing the gospel and being the light to your world. It's not about how slick you are and how well spoken you are, but it's about growing in courage, knowing that the message is real, that it's authentic, that you have authority, that you share it from a heart of integrity, that we have compassion welling up in us for others, and that our lives are such that it brings credibility to the word, and that we do follow through with the claims that we make. So my hope is that as you listen to this, that you think about, well, how can I be a better gospel communicator? How can I even teach others to be a good gospel communicator? And so for Paul, it's about character. So here's a question and some discussion for you to kind of end off this time with each other and to take some time to pray about this. But how has your character changed over the last 6 months? Where do you identify parts of growth? Um, Follow that up with what changes would you like to see happen? Where do you see your growth happening? How do you see yourself growing spiritually over the next little while? What would you like to see happen? And be sure to take some time to pray together, to encourage one another. And again, next week on September 16th, we'll be back at Victoria Drive Hall and we will be carrying on as usual. Until then, have a great Sunday and we'll see you soon. God bless.